Thank you. Did the destruction of the Irish Parliamentary Party effectively finally concede the partition issue to the Unionists? And was it partition rather than violence that made Dominion status possible? Because Dominion status for the whole of Ireland just would have been unthinkable. And was it Dominion status that cemented partition? Because it seems that it would be easier to unite two Home Rule parliaments than to unite one Home Rule parliament with a parliament that was effectively independent.
You got sort of 3 points there, but the first one is how important was the establishment of Northern Ireland Partition in facilitating an Irish settlement, which I know Michael has touched on. And the other one is, to what extent was partition a function, a result of the destruction of the Home Rule Party from 1914, 1969?
I'm just going to speak in terms of that question very briefly on chronology. I alluded to King George V opens the Northern Parliament at Belfast in June of 1921. That is 6 months before a treaty is signed. People kind of forget that, but that parliament was in existence. So people, from a nationalist perspective, want to deny or accept that by the time that treaty was signed. But in terms of Dominion status, what came afterwards, in the Dáil debates, and you can check those running all the way from the debate starting at first, I think December 5 of 21 till their conclusion 2.5 weeks later, rarely is partition discussed. If you were to weigh up those issues, it is about the issue of Home Rule, the Crown. There was a brilliant riposte from Sean McEntee to Collins about partition at the very end, by what Collins is missing about that should be read, but very little on that debate is discussed on partition. So I just want to refer back to Michael. Come back.
Michael, would you like to talk about partition as a facilitator?
The first part first of your three questions, no, I don't think that the defeat of the Home Rule Party was decisive in bringing about partition. Partition was effectively in existence already. It had been agreed between Liberals and Conservatives, demanded by Unionists, acquiesced in by Nationalists before the outbreak of the war. The only question was how many counties would be excluded and for how long. And on, I think it was the 28th or the 29th of July 1914, Asquith was sitting at his desk in Downing Street, working out the speech he would make that afternoon, making a final offer of county option, which would mean 4-county exclusion, but forever this time, with no time limit. And that was the offer he was going to make that afternoon, when the telephone rang. And at the other end of the line was Bonner Law, the Conservative leader, saying, war has broken out yesterday. The Austrian army is besieging Belgrade. Other countries are going to be involved, probably the United Kingdom. We must talk. We must put this Ulster question behind us. So partition had been agreed upon in 1914. The likely form that partition would have taken then would have been a division between 28 counties and 4 counties. In 1916, Redmond, in the Home Rule discussions that we've mentioned, gave way on the 2 counties of Fermanagh and Tyrone, with small but still significant Catholic nationalist majorities. His position was weaker. He was no longer in control, obviously, of Irish nationalists in the way that he had been in 1914. The Rising had shown that. And also, the balance of power in Britain had shifted. The Conservatives were no longer in opposition. They were now in government as a minority party. They were able to look after their Ulster allies better. And these 2 factors ensured that it was now 6 counties that was in question and not 4. So long before the destruction of the Home Rule Party in Southern Ireland, in December 1918, partition was effectively the agreed solution. Only the details needed to be worked out.
And finally, Michael, on the basis of, would a united Ireland at some date have been more possible on the basis of the 1920 Act and devolved parliaments really within the United Kingdom, rather than what emerged in the treaty, which was a dominion and the North included in Great Britain, in the UK?
Possibly, but I think the Ulster Unionists were so passionately opposed to any union, any form of union with the South by then. Southern and Northern Unionists had drifted apart. Effectively, the Southern Unionists felt abandoned, just as the Unionists in Donegal and Cavan and Monaghan felt abandoned, and they were, for very good reasons, abandoned by Unionists in the 6 counties. The image often used was of an overloaded raft raft that was sinking, throw a few members overboard to the sharks, and those that remain on the raft will survive. Otherwise, everybody will drown or be eaten by the sharks. The sharks, of course, being Irish Republicans. So I think that the pattern would have been, it might have been fractionally easier to work out a more civilized relationship between the two parts of Ireland. It's a hypothetical question. My answer is just a pure speculation. I think there wouldn't have been any significant move towards unification, even though Lloyd George's government had wanted ultimate unification, ultimately one Home Rule Ireland within the United Kingdom with Ulster Unionist consent. But that consent was highly unlikely. And after all, the Ulster Unionists in 1919 and 1920 succeeded in wrecking what had been the Walter Long Committee and Lloyd George's original policy, which was of a 23-county, 9-county division, with the whole province of Ulster being a separate entity. Craig said, no, too kind, too generous, too generous by a long measure. We want only 6. 9, too dodgy, too dangerous. So they were determined to defend what was defensible, to hold on to what they could without incurring too much extra danger, abandoning Donegal, Cavan and Monaghan, and they were not, I think, prepared to engage in any serious form of cordial relationship that might ultimately result in a united Ireland, despite the wishes of Lloyd George.
Just on the first point there about partition, I think the key date, if you want to know when there was no turning back from partition, is the 23rd of June 1916, the point at which John Redmond goes to St Mary's Hall on the Falls Road and gets the support of the vast majority, the supporters of the Irish Parliamentary Party, for this proposed introduction of a Home Rule settlement that would see at least a temporary exclusion of Ulster. From that point on, partition in some form, it's no going back from that time, and that has been in train since 1914. But the second part of your question that we haven't dealt on to as much of an extent is the extent to which the nature of Irish independence, Dominion status, whether or not that meant there was no going back from partition. I don't think it's so much the nature of the political entity of the Irish Free State, but it's the policies pursued by the government, the first government of the Irish Free State, whether or not it had been a Home Rule Parliament like Northern Ireland or whatever. The policies pursued in effect in the 1920s and 1930s, Home Rule in Southern Ireland was Rome Rule, and it's those policies, the refusal to allow legislation be introduced in the Irish Free State at any time that would permit divorce, the strict censorship of publications and films based very strongly on the demands and the lobbying of lay vigilante Catholic organisations are just some examples of it. The treatment of Southern Protestants, the best example being the famous Mayo librarian who was denied her job effectively because she was a Protestant. Those policies, the early years of the Irish Free State made sure that partition would stay in place for a lot longer.
Yes, I certainly would agree about the importance of the 23rd of June 1916, the Black Friday conference in St Mary's Hall. Although that fell through because of Southern Unionist rejection and Redmond abandoning it finally when it seemed to mean permanent partition, when Sinn Féin came to the conference table in 1921 and raised partition again, Lloyd George said, but this was accepted in principle by your predecessors in 1914 and 1916. Don't follow this compromise on us. In other words, you know, the geography of partition was shaped by the Redmond-Devlin Compromise of June 1916 in Belfast, St Mary's Hall. Have we another question? This gentleman. Sorry, Mr. Filster, Dr. Filster.
It's just a minor point triggered off by Dr. Costello's lecture when he mentioned a group called the American Committee for the Relief of Ireland. And it's a street on the Falls Road in the Beachmount area. And I used to wonder what Irish original name it came from, like Stranmillis, Shruggan-Millish, until a local was no particular pretensions to academic status or anything that informed me that that was built with money from America. The American Committee for the Relief of Ireland, Amcomri Street.
It's still there, called Amcomri Street. Yeah, built in 1921.